Welcome to the first episode in our new Koinonia podcast. In today's episode, we're going to talk about mission, vision, and the new ministry strategy for Koinonia. So let's get into it. Hey, you're listening to the Koinonia podcast, and on today's episode, I have two of the very best people here with me. I have my co-host, Heidi.
Hello.
How you doing, Heidi?
I'm good. How are you?
Good. And last but not least, we have our very own Pastor Bryan.
Hi, guys.
Boss, how's it going?
Yeah, it's going great.
Can I call you boss through the podcast like I always do?
If it works for you, yeah.
Makes me feel comfortable.
Good.
Before we jump into the episode, I have a question for you guys. It's a little bit of a would you rather situation.
Love it.
I want to know, would you rather be able to see one day into the future or 10 years into the future?
Wow.
I definitely would not want to see 10 years.
Yeah.
I feel like I would just know too much, and then I'd be scared for the next 10
Right.
years about when that's gonna happen or change. I feel like things will change. I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know. Unless
Or could
unless
you
I
change
see
them?
I
You know
don't
what I
know.
mean? You see you could see into the future, and then you could back to the future kind of situation, you know?
Seems like 10 years away, you'd always be waiting for it to happen and get to you. So I'd rather see one day into the
Yeah.
future and
One
prepare
day.
for that, one day at a time.
One day at a time.
Yeah, I'd just rather know, are my kids gonna melt down tomorrow, and can I
Right.
help fix that?
Yeah, that's a good
Yeah.
call. What am I going to have for dinner tomorrow so I don't have to think about it?
Exactly. These are the big problems right now.
These are the immediate issues. 10 years from now, no. I don't care.
Yeah.
We'll get there eventually.
Exactly.
As long as I know it's for dinner. Well, while we're talking about the future, Pastor Bryan, you are here today because we are going to be talking about some of the new refreshed vision that we have here at Koinonia and just the story behind all of that. So before we dive too deep into that, maybe you could just recap what that is for those who, someone listening might have already heard it, might have heard it a couple times, some maybe haven't heard it yet. So maybe you could just recap what that is, and we'll go from there.
Yeah. What we're going to dig into today is talking about, how do we do ministry in light of what we've just experienced in the last 2, 3, 4 years? How has that affected and changed us? And so as a team here at Koinonia, as leadership, we weren't just sitting around waiting for the pandemic to end. We began praying and asking, Lord, how do we do ministry? How do we make disciples who follow Jesus in the midst of what we've experienced in these crazy times? And so we as a leadership took time to press into that in the second half of 2021 and to get some fresh language and fresh heartbeat for how do we lead people to Jesus and disciple them to continue following Jesus. So that's a little bit of where we're going. Is that what you're looking for?
Yeah, and what is the new refresh vision for Koinonia, and what are the key words to that, and what is that going to be?
Yeah, one of the questions that we asked ourselves is, why do we exist as a church? And it was, as we summarized, pressed it down, what came out was some very simple language that's easy for us to hang on to and remember, is that we exist as a church to show and share the love of Jesus. That's what it's all about, is we're here to show Jesus and to share him with others. And then we began to talk deeper about that of okay, so how does that happen? What does that look like? What kind of culture do we need to maintain and work out of? And we came down to some three main words. One of them is we need a healthy culture. We need a culture that continues to encourage humility, and a culture that speaks to teamwork. And we know when we're operating in this way, then we're going to be able to more easily show and share who Jesus is and his love. And so that's what we just began to unpack and press into. But that process took a number of weeks and even a couple months of praying, conversations, asking for feedback from staff together, and then sharing it to see how it lands with people.
Maybe we could just roll back the clock a bit
Sure.
and just kind of go to the beginning of that process and where it all started. You kind of said back in beginning of 2020 or even 2019, some of this was already kind of in the works and asking these kind of questions. So maybe where would be a good kind of, where did it all begin? Like, where was the starting point to asking these questions?
Yeah. I think if I were to summarize down to, in 2019, we as leadership here at Koinonia were already pressing in. We were having some conversations about how do we make disciples in light of where society was at, where our culture was at. And we began to analyze and evaluate all of Koinonia's ministry, everything, everything that happened on a Sunday, on a Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, right through the conferences that we hosted. We analyzed everything and said, are we seeing kingdom fruit be produced out of what we're putting our time and energy to here at Koinonia? And that started us on a journey of just a lot of evaluation. And then the pandemic hit in 2020, which changed a whole lot.
Yeah.
By March of 2020, we had already started to implement some of the things we sensed out of our prayer times. And one of them is we needed to put a pause on some of our big events and conferences that we hosted at Koinonia. And so when the pandemic hit, that part of it didn't like cast fear into, oh my goodness, how are we still going to function as a church? Because we'd already started down this path of evaluating and asking God to give us greater clarity. But by a year into the pandemic, it's like, okay, this isn't going away quickly, and it has drastically changed and affected people, their lives, families. So what does that now mean for us as a church to relate with society, to minister and teach people, to share with them about who Jesus is? And that's what started our process in 2021 to say, what is this going to come out of? Where do we focus? So we simplified our ministries down to focusing on three main areas. We're going to focus on our Sunday services. We're going to focus on online ministry, because a lot of people were still online only. And we're going to focus on groups. And those would be our three main ministry areas. And we said, okay, if that's the area where we're going to focus our ministry, why do we exist then? What's our purpose as we walk out those ministry areas? And then out of our discussions came this focus of showing and sharing the love of Jesus. Can we do that in a service?
Yeah.
Yes. Can we do that online through online ministry, whether that's our services or a podcast or posting and teaching? Yes. Can we do that in groups? Absolutely. And so that started us in this journey of then what does it look like to show and share the love of Jesus in these main ministry areas?
Yeah. What I love about the show and share piece is just like it's so specific yet vague at the same time. It's like no matter what context it's in, like you're saying, if it's in a group or if it's in an event or something, it's like you get how you can do that in the context of that thing. So it's like it's vague enough where it's like it fits everywhere, but it's specific enough where it's like, oh yeah, I know what I'm supposed to do in this group and how to do that. Yeah. Just as you're talking, something I was thinking about, you were saying how like kind of this conversation started before the pandemic, and I wonder if like we kind of romanticize post-pandemic or pre-pandemic world, where it was just like, oh, things were so great before March of 2020, but it's like we kind of forget that like things maybe weren't always so great back then. Like just because it was, there was no masks or distancing or whatever, doesn't just mean it was all great. Yeah. And like I think church culture and like culture in general and where things were heading, it was like there was things to be concerned about. There was things to be worried about, like church attendance and like what is the future of the church world. These kind of things were starting to happen. So do you think...
And there was something to... Sorry, just talking about the word health, because you're obviously noticing some things about the health of the church and health of volunteers and health of teams and stuff like that. So I think that is part of the needing to have the conversation at the time. And obviously the pandemic halted things and in some ways gave people a big break. But still re-engaging people is difficult now.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that's what we were looking at. Absolutely. The conversations were centered around the health of a family, the health of our church community. And we were noticing as pastoral leadership, that people weren't attending church as regularly as church was offered. If you say a Sunday service, families weren't coming every weekend like had been the practice for many years before. And we were seeing, so what was changing that? Why weren't people coming as regularly? People were actually saying, oh yeah, we'd attend church regularly, and that would be maybe 2.5 times a month.
Right.
But in people's minds, that was regular. But what it didn't provide for us as leadership and as a church community was continuity to keep discipling and developing. And so we began to talk about families and what's families, what are they prioritizing now on a weekend? We talked about just families being tired from the work week, the school week, and they needed downtime on the weekends. And so, okay, are we adding to their busyness, or are we intentionally speaking into their lives? That was some of where our conversations were going.
Yeah, that's good. So as you're kind of having these conversations, you alluded to a few of the questions that the leadership was asking, like why do we exist as a church? But are there any other questions that were kind of leading you down the road, or what was the process like? Were there lots of questions that you were asking, or was it just very clear, like, oh, here's the 3 questions that we're trying to answer to lead us down this path?
Great. And can I also add, Ryan, so people know who we're talking about as leadership?
Yeah.
In 2021, it was our senior team that really began to press into this conversation. So Nathan Turner, Rebecca Ferguson, Tammy Adich, Larry Wood, and myself. And we were the ones who began to just have those, and Pastor Dave Champion as well. And we began to have those conversations of if we exist as a church to reveal God, to make God known, how do we do that? So the first one was knowing why we exist. The next one was, what's the culture or environment? What's our DNA that's going to come out of us? And that's where I talk about, we discovered that our culture really needs to be about being healthy, and I'll unpack that, humility and teamwork. And the health part of it is emotional health, mental health, physical health, and spiritual health. We considered if we're not healthy, if we're tired, we're burnt out, our emotions aren't in a healthy spot, it's pretty hard to show Jesus when you're angry at home or you're angry at society or whatever the issues were. And so we began to look at emotional health, which wasn't new to Koinonia. We've studied it and we've had small groups on it. But what does it mean to be emotionally healthy, expressing our emotions? We're now, big topic through the pandemic was mental health, and how we think things through and how we internalize them and then live out of our mental thought. And then we began to look at physical health is important as well, because if we're physically not healthy, is this message from Jesus really transforming all of our lives? And then the other aspect of spiritual health, which would be the obvious one at a church, but not to be ignored, is where are we at spiritually? Are we growing and maturing, or are we sliding back? And so health has to do with our culture, and humility is another big part of our culture. We see Jesus act in humility, do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit, but in humility consider others better than yourselves. And that's Philippians 2. And then Paul carries on in the chapter to say, Jesus did not consider equality with God as something to be understood, so he made himself nothing, taking on the nature of a servant. So we began to say these are key aspects to Jesus, so they need to be key aspects for us. We as a community need to operate in humility with one another and then with the world around us, so that they can start to see the love of Jesus in us.
Right.
And then comes teamwork. So that's another part of that culture aspect of teamwork. Refers to unity, being united together, being one family, one body, Scripture talks about. But really not just getting, that we can cope with each other, not just get along with each other, but actually care about one another in our church community. And we see these words in Scripture, but I think many times we take them for granted. Or we're just kind of like, yeah, it's a biblical word, carry on.
Yeah, right.
But do we put the effort into making sure this is part of how we operate with one another, humbly responding to one another, seeking to have unity in relationship, and maybe even helping each other get healthy, because that's ultimately going to be how we show and share the love of Jesus. So, Ryan, those only start with the first 2 questions.
Right. Are there more?
Yeah, there's more. Absolutely.
Yeah, I really like how those 3 words seem to work together, because when you are in a healthy place, even emotionally, mentally, spiritually, physically, all those things working together, then it's easier to show up with humility and to not have to kind of prove yourself or defend yourself. We're able to listen better. And then obviously within that, the Bible talks about how through humility, there's unity. Unity comes through humility, right? And so I think that helps us then to work together. So it makes sense to me that they go together. But maybe we could back up for a little bit, because one of the questions I think maybe people have is, Koinonia has always had this phrase, building relationships with God, one another, and the world, and then the 5 core values. And so maybe you could speak to, because this seems to me to be more like the culture within that the nuts and bolts of how to live those things out. But maybe you could bring some clarity to how those work together. Yeah,
that's right. That's good. Those core values that we have at Koinonia don't change, haven't disappeared. They're still there. They're core to the kingdom. They're core to the kingdom of God. Mission, worship, servanthood, stewardship, and generations. And we're not replacing them. They're still there. And they guide us. They propel us to want to love God, one another, and the world. But we began to ask the question, so what does that look like when we walk that out? And that's where this fresh vision language came to us, that it's going to help us walk out those core kingdom values that are still a part of the house here at Koinonia. It was like we were asking, okay, God, you've given us the great commandments, love the Lord our God with all our heart, soul, and mind and strength, and to love our neighbor as ourselves. And you've given us the great commission, go and make disciples. But how do we do that? And that's where we began to talk about practical language. What does it look like then to go and make disciples as we love one another? And these words of show and share the love of Jesus, and having a culture that will help propel us into that. And then we said, so what is it? What are we doing again? Oh yeah, we're loving people and inspiring everybody to follow Jesus. And as we do that, we will fulfill the great commandments and the great commission. But we weren't settled yet. It was still like, okay, so this is why we exist, and this is the culture we have, and this is what we're to do, is to love people. And so then how will we know if we're actually doing that? And that's where we pressed into something called strategic anchors, something that we can anchor onto to know if we're being effective in walking out the vision that will fulfill the mission that God's called us to. And the 3 strategic anchors we narrowed down to were that we want to be about personally connecting, consistently discipling, and authentically caring for one another. In whatever we do, we want to make sure those 3 things are happening. Because if they are, then they're going to lead us to loving one another. They're going to lead us to showing people who Jesus is. And they're going to lead us to fulfilling the mission that God has given us that's core to his kingdom.
When you say all these things, I'm wondering, like, to the person who would be listening to this and would say, this all sounds really great, but it also sounds really challenging. Like, oh my goodness, like when I go to the grocery store, I like to just put my headphones on and not talk to anybody and just get out as quick as I can. And like, I'm not a people person, and this authentic caring and connecting with people and health and humility, like it's exciting, but at the same time, it might feel like, oh my goodness, like, can I even be a part of this church if I'm not healthy, or if, it's hard for me to be humble, or I don't know if I like to work with people. So what would you say to someone who's like, maybe feels like this is a lot, like, I don't know how to do all these things. What would you say to that person?
I'd say still go grocery shopping. Don't
okay,
stop
good
grocery
to know.
shopping. Okay, it's okay to go grocery shopping.
Maybe just take your headphones out, like at the till, for a
moment,
and say hi.
Step.
That's a great example.
Don't use the self-checkout for once.
Yeah. Thinking in the context of, because that's a great example of how do we operate in the everyday world, like grocery shopping, people that we don't know. And then how do we operate within our church community of Koinonia? And our church community of Koinonia, we want it to be a safe place. We want it to be a place where we could ask questions that, hey, or admit things like, I don't feel very humble when I'm out and about, or I'm angry about things I see in the news. And can I talk about that with you so that because I want the love of Jesus to flow out of me, but how does that happen? And so when you say, how would I answer somebody? I'd say, come into the community of Koinonia.
Yeah.
Don't just attend an event or a service, but come into the community where you actually start to build relationships, Where, say, if I'm a parent, bring my kids in and I see Pastor Heidi on a Sunday morning, it's not just like, here, dump my kids, make them better, make them more like Jesus. I'm going to go in there for a while. It's like, hey, Pastor Heidi, tell me about what's happening in kids ministry, because we're doing this together. And then all of a sudden Heidi says, hey, Bryan, are you new to the church? Why don't you come over for a meal? And we'd love to get to know you. And so entering into the community of Koinonia will allow some of God's heartbeat to rise up in all of us collectively together, so that it's not I've just got to get healthier and I got to know my Bible more and I've got to really be inspired to, tell people about Jesus. No, actually, it's going to come out of our relationships that we have in the house is going to overflow to making it more desirable to have relationships outside of Koinonia.
Yeah, that's so good.
I think that's my journey, really. No, I think it is my journey, what you're describing, because coming in even as a young kid, I was 9 years old, and I was just fearful, and it was hard to get to know other kids. And I think that kids even can feel that way and feel like, am I, do I fit in? And I think that's totally a valid question to be asking. How does this apply to me? But it was within the community of being known and someone speaking value over me and noticing me, and someone knew my name. Yeah. And I began to know other people's names, and someone would save me a seat or whatever. It's those small things that then build up to, years later feeling like, yeah, this is a place where I can call home. These are my people. Yeah. And we encourage one another and we challenge one another. And so I think we have to see it as a journey. And I'm still on that journey. It's not like you just arrive. I think you come to a place where it keeps changing and you have to adapt to the community. This is where we learn to be like Jesus, right? Is to be challenged by other people and to find our place within it.
Yeah, that's good. And so therefore, as a community, as a church together, it's healthy for us to have the open conversations of how we feel. I might feel lesser than or intimidated by, or I don't measure up. I remember hearing people describe Koinonia. They would come into the parking lot and they felt like they were the person of the lowest income driving into that parking lot. They felt like, look at all the expensive cars and look at everybody's lives as they came into the foyer. Everybody's got it together. And those were just lies that the enemy was feeding them to keep them out of community with Koinonia.
Yeah, it's good.
Because we are all very, very similar. We drive four-wheel cars. None of us have hovers that we hover into the parking lot and set down our spaceship. We're so much alike. Yeah. But the lies get in there and they detract us from entering into community, right? Like you said, even as a kid, those thoughts, we have those thoughts too. So part of the journey for us is to make, for Koinonia to become a safe environment, community, where we can be real and authentic with one another, whether that's in the foyer, whether that's after a message and you're compelled to pray with somebody. Step into that and do that with one another. Have the conversation, because we're more alike than we are different.
Yeah, that's so good. I feel like the challenge of like church culture, like for us who like grew up in it, it's kind of like you get to that point where you feel like you have to put that mask on like every Sunday. You know what I mean? Like you have to pretend to have it all together. It's like there's like a pressure that comes with it. So I love that. It's just like, no, that doesn't, it's not it at all, right? Like I was also thinking about when you're talking about health, like myself, I rather just bury everything and just like pretend like everything's okay and just be like, I don't have time to deal with all this. I just want to like get the job done. I just want to like push through. But like I love that we're kind of putting the focus on like, you know what? It's better to like hit pause and figure that stuff out, because when we are in a place where you're healthy, you can accomplish so much more. And you're just going to like crash and burn. And it's not going to be great. You can push. One day it's all going to crumble if you're not taking that time to, get healthy and be humble and work with other people. So I love that it's kind of focusing on that. It's just like we're all dealing with stuff. We all are at different places. Like you just said, Heidi, it's like a journey. We're always on a journey. And it's just wherever you are, just come and be in community with people and grow in your relationship with God. So I love that so much.
Oh, it sounds easy to do, but I think this brings up an obvious question about how the pandemic has affected how we do this. Because obviously people are, I think we're coming to a place now where things are hopefully opening up and things are always shifting and changing in terms of restrictions, but there's still a mentality around distancing and in a hope, and trying to keep people safe, etc. But how does this go together then with what you're saying about reaching out and being part of the community? What do you see the challenges of this, I guess?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there definitely will be challenges. And we know that if I speak scripturally, and what Jesus described is there is an enemy who's out to steal, kill, and destroy us, our faith, God's design of being together in community. And our emotions fit into all of that. And the last 2 years have only escalated that. If you think about last summer, 2021, we were talking more about grief, and we were grieving what we've lost in the last year, what won't be the same, what we're not going to be able to go back to. But fast forward now to a year further on, and we're 2 years having experienced the pandemic, and we're more expressing emotions of anger, frustration, lack of tolerance, lack of trust for leadership, whether that's local leadership or governmental leadership. And so those would be some of the challenges that are definitely right in our face, and I would say on the surface of our emotions, that are going to impact how we do life and faith going forward after this pandemic. And so a big part of that is all of us need to keep clinging to Jesus because we can't right the wrongs in and of our own abilities. We can take ourselves so far, right? We can muster up a positive outlook. We can muster up some joy for the moment, but it can fizzle out pretty quick if it's confronted with an area of tension or frustration or anger. I think of the Apostle Paul in Galatians when he was speaking to that church, and he said to them, literally get rid of anger, bits of rage, or fits of rage, and bits of rage.
Any kind of rage.
Yeah.
All the rage, get it out.
He literally told the people to get rid of it. And then he called them into unity and love and care for one another, which only is possible when we're walking closely with Jesus, individually. And so, but then the church is about walking with Jesus together. So what I like is we're going to be able to face some of these challenges together. So Ryan, as you say, you press some of that emotions down. That's some of your natural response to do that. If I'm a friend with you, I'm going to notice that in you. And I'll say, hey, Ryan, you just seem like you're bottling something up. Would it be helpful to talk about that?
Right.
Or
no, it wouldn't be helpful. Not on a podcast. So therapy's for.
Maybe later.
Yeah, take it offline. But that's part of authentically caring. You and I caring for one another.
Yeah.
Facing rather than ignoring the challenges of, oh, Heidi, it looks like you're having a really rough week with your kids or your family, and if I just ignore that and let's just get the job done, that's not a healthy response. But if we step into that together, and I share with you that I want to help you walk through your challenges so you don't feel alone, I believe we'll feel an anointing, a settling of God's grace on us, because that's God's heart for us to do it together, thinking about one another, walking with one another. And then as we have a healthier church community, we'll know how to respond to this world around us that is given up on hope, that is given up on governmental leadership, whatever it might be. We're going to be able to bring them hope and encouragement because we've got something that's out of this world, but it's within us that we can share with them.
I think that's so good to think about that, because we just did that the other day, and we were connecting and meeting, and it's like we could have just easily been about the task. But I just shared about something I had seen on social media that was bothering me, and you had said like, oh yeah, I get that. I've seen what you're seeing. And we just talked it through and then prayed about it. And I think it didn't solve the problem, but I felt supported and I felt like you cared, right? And I think that that's a big part of what we're talking about, is that does show the love of Jesus, not that it fixes everything for you, but that you feel like you can be open, right? And that you feel like there's people who authentically care about you. And I think that was just a good example for me to say, I don't want it to just be about the task at hand. That can be easier to do, like you're saying.
Yeah, right.
Just
it's easier to just, forget the stuff and just do the task.
Yeah, and that's not what you're saying in this list of vision. Yeah. You're not saying, these are the tasks at hand, everyone. You're saying, no, this is a way of living and a way of connecting and a way of supporting one another and a way of, so that the love of Jesus is truly experienced.
Yeah. And can I speak to what might seem obvious, but is good for us to slow down and recognize, is we are human beings, But we often, and this phrase didn't start with me, we often enter into being human doings. We just want to get the task done. We want to do the job. We want to let's get on with building the church and forget about everything else. But God never really called us to build his church. He didn't call us to get all the tasks done. So for all of you who have task lists and to-do lists, but you're probably never going to get them all done. What God called us to do is love one another and love the world around us. And I've expressed it this way before, is that when we all stand before Jesus, when we get to heaven, whatever that will look like, I truly believe that God is not going to line us up, those of us who attended Koinonia, served at Koinonia, and say, hey, that service that you led back in January of 2022, that was one of my favorites that I've ever seen you guys do. Or for kids ministry, I don't think God's going to say, oh, Heidi, you knocked it out of the park when you put that script together for the puppet play that the kids laughed. That was the best. What he's going to ask us is, hey, Koinonia Church, you're all standing here in front of me. During 2020 and 2021, when the pandemic was on, the stress was on you, how did you guys love one another? How did you love not only each other, but how did you love Waterloo region? It was very divided. I saw it. But did you love one another through that time? Because truly that's what he's commanded us, very simply, the 2 commandments, to love him and to love each other. And I believe what this vision language incorporates within it, when we do those commands of love, then we're going to see people come and want to respond to Jesus because we're caring about them. We're actually speaking into or asking them questions that allows them to share, and we're listening, and then we're speaking into where their heart is hurting. And then they're going to be open to say, tell me more about the hope you have, and why do you even go to church regularly?
Yeah.
Why is this important to teach your kids? And we could say, because the love of God has done something in my heart and our families that we want to see that love. You experience that love as well.
That's so good. That's so good. I have one last question. This is a bonus question. Where do you see the Big C church in like 5 years from now? I know that we'd all agreed that it'd be better to only say one day into the future.
Yeah.
Can we go at least 5? We'll split the difference between 10 years and now. 5 years from now. Yeah. And what would be your hope to see the church?
My hope and my concern. So my concern is where I can see the church could be in 5 years if we don't adapt and change, that the church is going to become archaic. I truly believe that if we try and do things like we used to do as a church community 5 years ago or more, in this post-pandemic situation, that the church is not going to be relevant to our community, right? Because people have new fears, new areas that cause anxiety and stress. And we have the message is still the same. The message doesn't change from God of hope for them, of salvation and eternity and God's love. But what we need to do is find a new way of delivering it that connects with where their hearts are at now.
Right.
The area of lack of trust. Whatever the leadership was in place over the last 2 years couldn't make a decision that would please everybody. And so people then feel like, well, then why trust leaders or why follow leaders? So as a church, we can't show up and say, we've got it all figured out. We are the best leaders to follow, because that's already a premise that people don't adhere to. So we need to come with a different message of, actually, this love and hope got us through the pandemic. This love and hope is building our families and our community as a church again, because it's something eternal. It's not something temporary. This love and hope message can get through any pandemic, any storm, because it's meant for us to have internally, not just to cope and survive something externally. So to answer your question, the thought is, if we as a church don't adapt and change to bring the message of hope in a new era, then we're going to become irrelevant.
Right.
My hope is something that never changes is people, the existence of people. Yeah. And Jesus was all about, his mission was people. His mission wasn't to get to a certain destination and he's got to preach there before sunfall. No, his mission was to do what the Father put on his heart that day. And so it was always people. And so my hope is that we as a Koinonia community will recognize the people right in our midst around us, learn to love one another in humility, because then the world's going to see that we have an eternal message that they're going to want.
Yeah. Wow, that's so great. That is so good. Thank you for sharing your heart on all of this, and thank you for all the time that you and the senior team put into developing this and really working all this through and figuring out what really matters for the future of not just this church, but just, like you're saying, just in general, and the hope that we can offer the world. No matter what comes our way, who knows what's going to happen in 5 years, but no matter what happens, it's like you're saying, there's hope that we can offer. People are people, and no matter the context of what we're in, we can always find hope. So thank you for that and for sharing today.
I'm excited for where God's going to take us together. It's going to be great.
What a great conversation that we had in today's episode. If you took something away, why don't you share it with someone? If you know someone that could benefit from hearing what you just heard or seeing what you just saw, why don't you share it with them so that we can all continue to have these conversations about things that we deal with in everyday life and this journey that we're on, because we are all better together. Make sure that you're subscribed so you don't miss any of the upcoming episodes, and we will see you in the next one.